Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the Cram Podcast. So I wonder, how did our gut become so popular? People these days are super interested in gut health. You go online, you'll be inundated with articles on the latest research on gut health. You can't check out at a grocery store without noticing magazines on gut health, the gut microbiome and its relationship to disease. And that's because research, and there's a lot of it happening, is showing how important our gut is to overall health. Diseases like cancer, heart disease, autoimmune diseases, and even mental health conditions like depression, they've all been connected to what's been called our second brain. A leading researcher who's making significant discoveries in gut health is Dr. Deanna Gibson. Deanna is a microbiologist and professor in the Department of Biology at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus, and she joins us. Hello, Deanna.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
So nice to have you. So, when I was growing up, the only time I ever heard the word gut was usually if it was someone got punched in the gut and I didn't live in a rough neighborhood, or something was gut wrenching. And that was about it. How did you get interested in gut research?
Actually, it was probably personal because there's a lot of my family members who always had ailments with their gut. And so, when people suffer, it's like chronic and it's hard to see, right? So I was a child just sort of watching people in my life have symptoms. And so we did actually talk about it a lot, even though it wasn't really like something that probably normal people talked about at that time. And so it was always just really curious to me. It's obviously a really important part of your health and well-being and how you function and the quality of your life. So that's why.
So that term that, people have been using about the gut being our second brain, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that for a number of reasons. One, because there are lots of connections physically to the brain. And number two, because the gut microbiome, which isn't it's exogenous to ourselves, but it is intimately related to communication with the brain.
Maybe we better start off with a bit of a primer on the gut. Explain what the gut microbiome is.
It's a collection of microorganisms. It includes bacteria, viruses, protists, fungi, and they sort of exist in an ecosystem, which can be symbiotic. It can also be harmful depending on the context, but it interacts very closely with your intestinal epithelial cells, which then communicate with your immune cells. And so there's a relationship between the gut microbiome and yourself to sort of form a conversation that can equal good health, or it could sort of give us clues that there may not be good health.
So the way all those, it sounds very complicated. There's so much involved with the gut microbiome. Is everything when you're healthy, right? Everything is in balance, like everything is in symbiosis, it's working well.
Yeah. And it's really not, that black and white either. It's actually a fairly dynamic situation. Anything could set it off, but as long as you can be resilient and your immune system can respond, but then also shut down when it needs to, that's absolutely normal. But there's a lot of things that are going on in there. It is actually very complex and also fascinating, which is why I think it gets so much press.
Yeah. So can you talk about like the different roles that it plays, with like digestion, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. So digestion is probably a really easy one for most of us to sort of appreciate, right? Because the gut microbiome and its collection of genetic material it offers the host or us the ability to digest things that we might not actually have the enzymes or the genetic material to produce like proteins that will be involved in that digestion. So they help us in that matter, or maybe they don't help us. Maybe they extract too many calories and they lead to somewhat of a more obesogenic situation in a host. So they play a really big role in digestion, but also our metabolic health. And it just depends on which microbes you have, or maybe more importantly, all the functions that they contribute in the ecosystem or in the community.
Mm-hmm. Because all microbiomes are not equal.
They're not. They're different. And, one of the things that I was really fascinated about for the first part of my career is, well, where does it all come from? Like, what controls that? How do we get there in the first place? And that's what led me to think about diet, because diet is a pretty major player in that. But also, like your environment plays a really big role. So I started looking at, different places. For example, I completed a study in India looking at the microbiome there, because that place is a very fascinating environment. And so environmental factors play a really big role. Maybe genetic factors play a role in your initial starting material of your microbiome.
So can you talk about that? Like, how does it start? How do we get it?
Well, you get it from, when you're born, right? So the maternal transfer is probably the very first starter of your whole ecosystem. And then all of the things that you experience in the first few years of your life, maybe the environments that you experience, maybe your parents or your grandparents, or your siblings, or the fact that you are in a daycare or not. So all of these different exposures help us collect all the various organisms that are present. But the biggest factor really is what mom does, right? So what mom gives you, that maternal transfer, and then also what does mom feed you? Is it breast milk? Is it what dietary influences are playing a role in mom's situation? And then, okay, if you're formula fed, okay, what's being exposed in that particular formula? Some of them have probiotics or not, or you're not getting those microbes, right?
Yeah.
So lots of factors play a really important role.
Do you know what I find interesting too? What you just talked about, those major influential factors in the development of our microbiome, they're all early. They're in the earliest stages of life, right? What our mother gives us, what she's eating, what she transfers on to us. And then I read somewhere that it actually makes a difference whether you've had a vaginal birth or a cesarean. Is that true to your microbiome? How does that work?
True.
How does that work?
That's very true, because when the baby goes through the vaginal canal, then baby's all exposed to mom's vaginal microbiome, but also her fecal microbiome, right, in that process. Whereas if baby's cut out of the stomach and there's a C-section, baby doesn't get exposed to all of those things. Baby's instead exposed to the skin microbiome, or maybe the microbiome that's more in the environment, right? In the hospital environment. So there is a big starting difference there. And there's a lot of epidemiological studies to support that might matter, right? Like in terms of allergies development, or other sort of immune mediated disease developments.
But which is better then?
Well, vaginal birth is better.
Being exposed to that fecal material.
Yes, absolutely. Because that fecal material, I mean, have you heard of like poop milkshakes and stuff?
No. Is that on your daily menu, Deanna? What is that?
But fecal transplants, right? Like
right.
a lot of animals are actually coprophagic. So that means they eat poop, really, right?
Yeah.
You're getting this
Dogs.
poop milkshake, or even like there's some researchers who are giving like sort of this poop milkshake to baby who are being C-section, just to restart their flora to what is more natural, which is of course through the vaginal canal, right? And you actually want to get that fecal exposure, because that's ultimately what baby is going to develop in the first period of time.
Right.
Those
So
microbes are good.
that's, oh gosh, it's so amazing. I mean, that really gets you off to a good start then, doesn't it? Like that kind of sets the path right there.
That's the idea. That's our understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then, so once you're born, and you've got, I guess, your early microbiome, what would be the major factors that are then going to influence its development, like its course?
Diet is
Yeah,
probably
so diet would
one
be,
of the
yeah,
biggest ones. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, probably things like, are you in a daycare? So
Ah,
hygiene, right? Like that would be a big one as well. And I think probably the dirtier, the more exposure you get, the better. There is a
hmm,
concept of the hygiene hypothesis. Granted, it is a hypothesis. And I've contemplated it a lot over the last 20 years. And I start to wonder, how come we don't have that hypothesis proven yet? But I think there's some
mm,
truth to that. Like, there is a book written by, Dr. Brett Finley, like Let Them Eat Dirt. And I think there's a lot of insight there in a really nice way to understand. And so hygiene is a really big one too, right? Like if you were
yeah.
born here in North America versus if you were born, say, in India, like rural India, there's going to be major hygiene differences.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems epidemiologically that it will be better for you to be exposed to things that don't kill you, but more exposure, the better. Right? Because it
Oh, yeah.
corresponds with the development really of your immune responses. And your immune system is
Ah,
very immature as an infant. And your microbiome is there to really start those conversations. And depending on what you're exposed to, who you're exposed to, and the dynamic of that microbial community, right? Your
yeah.
immune system really develops tolerance to some of these things, an immunological tolerance or not. And that can matter for disease development later, like for especially like autoimmune diseases or allergies, right? It can set you down the developmental pathway in the right way or perhaps in a dysfunctional way.
Oh my good. Is that still theory or has that been proven? You know, like those early
Ah,
indicators of vaginal birth versus cesarean, breast milk versus from all those early things. And then looking at children or even adults down the road and whether they have allergies or whether they developed autoimmune diseases.
mm.
Like, do we know that the relationship there? I don't know how strong it is.
I would say it's a reasonably strong relationship.
Mm.
Of course, scientists are always going to tell you we need to know more. So I wouldn't say it's like black and white, right? Like, for example, who are the major players? Which microbes do we need? If we had those answers, then we'd probably solve a lot of problems, which we're not quite at that stage yet, right? And we
Hmm.
have to be really careful too, forging forward in that, because infants are a vulnerable population. And whatever we do early on for prevention might actually really matter later on. And what if, do we know enough to make those decisions right now? Right. And I mean, like,
Yeah.
okay, if mom can't breastfeed, okay, if mom can't, okay, so is there a formula then that has like a really complex mixture of microorganisms that we could recommend? We're not quite at that stage yet, right?
Yeah.
I think that there's
Yeah.
a couple of options, but the question really is do we have enough data to suggest that actually that's effective? And so we're
Mm.
not there 100%, but I feel like there's enough information for us to feel confident we're heading down the right paths,
Yeah.
and really starting to unravel those things.
So, what's the connection with the development of allergies and autoimmune disease and the gut? What's that connection?
Well, because So remember when you asked, do you think that this is the second brain? Part
Mm-hmm.
of that is, connected to the immune system too. The immune system is like an amorphous system. And there are more immune cells in your gastrointestinal tract than really anywhere else. And so that matters, right? Because your immune cells move back and forth, and they also set the stage for, do you have what's called tolerance? Do you have the right antigens being presented to these various like soldier immune cells to say that your immune system should not attack yourself, which of course is autoimmunity, right?
Yeah.
Do you have those sort of developmental checks and balances in place? And your microbiome most likely plays a very important role in that. And the reason why we know that is because there's this one cell, the T regulatory cells, that are very, very important for sort of controlling, like, do you have an immune response? Okay, now does it decrease the immune response when you no longer need it? And those cells are very much influenced by the different types of molecules or different types of things that microbes show. And early on, that's very important for understanding if actually you would develop an autoimmune response, specifically in a various tissue, or more systemically like lupus, for example, or whether you're going to get asthma or allergies. Like, all those things are connected to the control of your immune cells, right? And your immune development.
Well, this was what I was puzzling over, how do we know that if something is not working right? So let's say something is affecting your immune system in your gut. How do you know that, it's going to be, let's say, lupus as opposed to another disease like cancer or some sort of heart issue? Do you know, right? How do you differ? How does the body differentiate between that and the development of future diseases and conditions?
Well, it's super, super complex, right? And so we'll just like sort of take that apart based on, let's start with like an autoimmune disease. Like, how would you have a systemic autoimmune disease versus, say, a localized one to, I don't know, say your thyroid, right? Right. Like, and that depends on where your antibodies are targeting. So your antibodies are the things that often do that autoimmune damage. They bind to something that maybe looks like a microbe, but actually it's yourself. And that causes damage, right? And so the ones in lupus are just, they're floating around your whole body, right? They're not attacking. And the ones that are localized, it's localized to that type of tissue. And so depending on where in the developmental pathway that goes wrong, or what antigen or what molecule from what tissue in your body is being sort of presented, that is sort of how it
on
happens.
A different course. Like,
yeah.
it can,
Yeah. But if you're talking about cancer, like, cancer is just, it's different than, say, an autoimmune disease, right? I mean, it's the same in that, you're still, attacking yourself, but it's very different from an immunological point of view. So in cancer, you actually want your immune system to function for you. We have cells that are very important specifically for targeting things that go wrong in our body that ultimately leads to what we call cancer. Cancer is something that's just continuously potentially happening all the time for a multitude of various reasons. And your immune cells, like they're called natural killer cells or your cytotoxic T cells, they're there to keep things down and they target them. So you need your inflammatory response to keep cancer in check your whole sort of life, right? Because there's a zillion things that could go wrong that could lead to cancer. Like, maybe you were exposed to something, or maybe you're, genetically you were predisposed to this thing not working or this thing being too highly expressed.
But what is the relationship between the gut, the gut microbiome, and cancers?
Yeah. And so the other way that cancer can happen is if you have too much chronic inflammation for too long. And so, if you're talking about like colon cancer, that typically tends to be the case, right? And so you can have microbes that drive too much of a pro-inflammatory response, like an IBD, for example, right? So that could lead to a risk in increase sort of colonic cancer. But the relationship between microbes or the microbiota, gut microbiota, and cancer, actually, it's not my area of research, but what I've understood is that it's the treatment responses. So, for example, there are people who respond to various cancer treatments because they have either the right microbiome, and people who don't respond because they don't have the right microbiome. So it seems that the microbiome may be playing a role in one's ability to respond favorably to cancer treatment. And so there's some really interesting stuff going on there. And I'm sure there's a ton more to be discovered as we sort of unravel all of these relationships in the next few years.
And what is the role of inflammation? Because we hear that a lot, right? With inflammation, the microbiome.
So you need inflammation to be alive. Inflammation is just so fundamentally important for so many things. Inflammation, it gets a lot of bad press, but actually we love inflammation. We need inflammation, right? Because otherwise we'd really literally be dead. Our inflammatory response controls so many different things. It's just when it's unregulated, it becomes actually a problem. So you want to be able to have an immune response because you don't want to get an infectious disease and have it overtake your body, right? Like our inflammatory response says, hey, that's an invading pathogen. I need to turn on and get rid of that. That shouldn't be here. And so it does. But the problem is that all the mechanisms and tools that your inflammatory cells have to actually cause damage to those invading microbes also damage us. It damages our own cells. And so if that inflammatory response isn't regulated, isn't balanced in the way that it sees the pathogen, it gets rid of it, and then it goes, I don't need to respond anymore. It continuously causes damage. And then that can be viewed as chronic inflammation. That causes a lot of symptoms and the pain and all of the things that humans don't like to feel, right? And then you're sort of lacking like the healing response. So the healing response is a very important part of that cycle. So we need inflammation to survive. We need it to make sure that it's responding to things that shouldn't be in our body so they don't kill us. And then we need it to stop. And then we need to go through a healing process. And it's typically somewhere in that cycle that breaks down if you have a chronic inflammatory disease, like inflammatory bowel disease, for example, or arthritis, or even like diabetes, right? It's like something has broken down in some part of that pathway where now you have this sort of inflammatory response that's no longer your friend and it's no longer helpful. And it's the thing that's making your life full of grief.
So just going back to what you said about the immune cells, and I think you said there are more in the digestive tract. Is that right? Than anywhere else?
There's a lot of immune cells there. Yeah.
Okay. A lot of, and they're moving around, right? Like they're traveling.
It's amorphous. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So they're also traveling up to the brain, aren't they?
Well, you do have a lot of immune cells, that can communicate, sort of at the blood-brain barrier. And then you also have immune cells in the brain too. Yeah. And they send signals to each other, to sort of communicate with what's going on. Yeah. But the brain immune system is really, really a lot more complex. And, when I sort of grew up learning about immunity, we used to say that the brain was a place where we didn't have any immune responses. And that's just so not true. Like we've learned so many things over the last few years, to indicate that that's just not true at all. But it is a special place, right? So it doesn't look the same as the rest of our body, let's say, right? It's a very important place of our body. And so there's more checks and balances going on there and lots of things that we just don't understand yet.
So I'm wondering, regarding the gut is a relationship, and I think I've read about this in some readings, the relationship between the gut and also mental health and, conditions like depression or anxiety. And even I think, a relationship between, diseases like, Alzheimer's,
Yeah.
Parkinson's. Like so
Yeah.
what do we know about that?
Well, that's true. Everything that you said is true. I would say there's enough experimental evidence to support that those things are true, but we don't exactly understand how they work. Although there's a few things that we could point to.
Okay.
So, for example, there's a pathway that seems to be particularly important. It happens to be what's called the tryptophan pathway, which is really just an amino acid that you would find in some of your food, right? Connecting it back to diet. But that pathway seems to be particularly interesting and important for connecting the gut microbiota, but then also things like serotonin in the intestine and other metabolites that are essentially important for brain health. And so some of those metabolites can travel across the blood-brain barrier. Some of them can't, but they do influence sort of what's happening from the gut, even to the liver, and then also to the brain. And those metabolites, if they're disbalanced in the brain, can sort of indicate like if you're going to have psychosis or depression or various things like that. And so I do think it is connected to diet. Some of the things that I've personally worked on is some more environmental pesticide exposures. And some of those things could look like various brain pathologies. In our own work, we did find some clues, not definitive, but some clues that may be Parkinson's disease. But I just read a new article showing basically that same pesticide was connected to Alzheimer's disease. And so there's a really big article in Nature just published this week showing that connection. So I think we're really going to unravel some of these things over the next few years.
So, I mean, okay, outside of perhaps chemicals that we may not be able to control exactly, like in our environment, like pesticides, we're not sure when we might come in contact with certain toxic chemicals. What about diet? Because we said earlier, diet is so important. Do we know what we can have in our diet that will help protect us from the possibility of diseases?
Yeah, I'd say the lessons I've learned over the last really decade of doing research in this area is that we should definitely not eat processed foods. And I mean, it's really actually hard to do in North America because like I did a study looking at microbiome, but then also connected it to diet with people from India and then Indo-Canadians and then Canadians, just to understand patterns. And what was really curious to me is that people in India, even though they're going through a rapid sort of westernization, they eat very, very little of their calories from processed foods. Whereas in North America, like most of us actually take like 60% of our calories from processed foods, which is an enormous amount. And it's like, a power bar or like those are all processed things, right? And so you have to be wary about all the things that go in there, like all of the emulsifiers that we all are exposed to, but like really should we be? All the chemicals that we spray on our foods. For example, like I just did a study with glyphosate and very, very low physiological levels that we would all be exposed to, produce very shocking results for me to even sort of comprehend, like if that's how we are going to do our agricultural systems, what does that mean?
Yeah. What is that?
Okay. So digress in this. So glyphosate is actually the active ingredient in Roundup. And in North America, we not only spray it in our forests and our food systems, and it's an important economic consideration for us as Canadians and North Americans. But the consequence really is that there could be things that are, happening to us from a health perspective. So are we trading, our health in unknowingly, for some of these other economic gains, and conveniences. And so we did a study looking at really, really low levels of glyphosate exposure, and we did it maternally. So we're talking about generations after exposure, a few generations who still experience some interesting effects. Now, we did this in rodents, so it's obviously not a human study, but what it showed us was that exposure at very low levels that we would all be exposed to as North Americans can lead to various gut disturbances and an increase in inflammation, or what I was calling sort of a microcolitis, that led to a gut-brain sort of dysfunction with some behaviors that were not necessarily normal, right? More maybe on some motor defects and so I found that really, really fascinating, right? Because
disturbing, actually.
It's disturbing, yeah. But you might not see that, right, in a place that, like France, for example, they don't do that. They don't do that practice, right? And so it's really interesting that, these things are all tied to our food systems, and we're all even if I choose to have a healthy diet, right? Because you asked me, what would you eat?
Right.
But even if I choose to have a really healthy diet, let's say I ate a Mediterranean diet, it's low in processed foods and high in whole foods. But the reality is that if you ate it here, you would and you didn't get say an organic diet, you'd probably get a whole lot of chemicals that might have a meaningful effect.
Yeah.
We don't know, right? Because it's not something that we've studied in great detail yet. But I think people are studying that now.
That is such a good point, because you're right. The Mediterranean diet, it gets referred to so often, but I don't think I've ever heard anyone say, well, it depends where you eat that Mediterranean diet, right?
Yeah,
I mean, to your point. Your point.
Yeah. And so, recent clues in literature are suggesting, even from our own studies, that while a Mediterranean diet is actually a good diet to choose, right? Especially for inflammatory bowel disease patients, because it helps them stay in remission. It helps them keep their inflammation low. When we did a metabolomic study on it, we also found a lot of weird chemicals that were in there just because of the nature of you are eating whole foods, that if you eat a lot of fruits and vegetables too, right? It can come with a lot of extra chemicals that may not be washed off, or maybe you didn't bother washing it off, or things like that, right? And then if you eat a lot of grains or lentils or chickpeas, those are all sprayed with glyphosate. And so you have this residual stuff. I'm not saying that processed food or whatever the Western diet is better. It's obviously not, because as soon as you package something up, it's all there too, right? And you add all these extra things, like emulsifiers, which I think is the next big thing. I think that a lot of those things that we didn't think about could in fact have some of the negative effects on our gut health, and therefore on your metabolic health, and therefore on your mental health, right? So it's all connected.
Right. Yeah.
But I think if I had any advice at all, certainly to my family, is just don't buy everything that's in a box. Literally avoid the entire middle aisle, right? And don't eat any, that's sort of our general rules. Just don't eat anything that has got lots of food dyes in it, but I mean, you can't avoid everything, right? You can't avoid all grains and all lentils. And so maybe you wash a whole bunch of times. I have no idea if that helps or not, but it's just having some awareness around it, I suppose. But then also, we need to actually have better policies that support our ability to choose to have a healthy sort of lifestyle and diet, right?
Now, didn't you develop, because you're very interested in autoimmune conditions like colitis, right? And irritable bowel disease. Yeah. And
inflammatory bowel disease.
yes.
Yep.
And didn't you come up with, or you created these probiotics to help treat that?
Yeah. One of the things that I was always very, very curious about was, if the gut microbiome is so important, and you were born with a bummed one, what can you do about it? And if you couldn't control, various factors, what can you do? And obviously, people have been talking about probiotics forever. I mean, forever. But when you look at the data and you start digging through all the literature on live biotherapeutics, so probiotics is, you buy it over the counter, but live biotherapeutics is meant to treat a condition. And so when you look at, you dig into all that literature and you find the clinical trials, it's actually super disappointing, especially when I started that project, 10 years ago, to find that most of the time, actually, there's really nothing going on. That probiotic did nothing in that disease condition. And if you dig deeper, then you find that when a probiotic is successful or a live biotherapeutic is successful, it's because there wasn't a condition that had chronic gut inflammation at the heart of the disease. So vaginosis works great for, irritable bowel syndrome, they work great for, but inflammatory bowel disease has chronic inflammation at the heart of the disease. Probiotics don't work great. The results are always they're ineffective, or they're inconclusive, or they're contradictory. What's going on there, right? But we know that some probiotics have the potential to do a multitude of things that appear at the surface anyway to have a positive effect on, say, colitis. And so, my postdoc at the time and I were thinking about this, and he actually came to me and said, well, let's just genetically engineer some probiotics. And I was like, oh, is that a good idea? I don't know. And then I was like, okay, let's try it, right? Because there are some bacteria that are really amazing at exploiting inflammation. And in fact, their whole survival strategy depends on it. And so we just took some of those genes, right, and we plunked them into some other favorite probiotics, really with the idea that we would just have, a bug that is beneficial, but we would give it the genetic tools to sort of persist in the face of inflammation, or to colonize more efficiently in the intestine. And so they're genetically modified. They are still native. They're still natural probiotics, and that all the things that they do, they're still there. But what we did is we gave them genetic tools to have a fighting chance to really just be in the intestine during the disease, so that they could initiate repair and maybe get to the other side and help with maintaining health. So that's what we did.
And you were successful.
Well, we have done it in a multitude of rodent models, and we did do it in also a pig model, and it was successful. Yes. But we haven't tried it in humans yet. That's the next phase of the journey.
Is it going to go there then? You're going to do it with humans?
Yes, we hope to. Well, we hope to gain IND clearance from the FDA. So that's a journey that we have to get through. But we are taking the right steps to hopefully get it there.
That's exciting. What about side effects?
Yeah, it's like you're listening in on my other conversation. So we think about safety all the time. I mean, one of the things that I went into this with was, should we do this? Right. I thought about that for a long time. For sure. So should I tell anybody I'm doing this, or should it be released into the world? I thought about that for a good decade. Right. But safety is the number one thing. And so far we could overdose our pigs, for example, and they don't have any negative side effects, because remember, most of these probiotics are generally regarded as safe. Right.
Yeah.
So, but
that's
I think
pretty exciting, though.
Yeah.
I mean, I really was impressed by what you said about failure in one of the videos I saw when you were asked about challenges. And you said living as a scientist, personally, living with failure is difficult. It's
It
very
is.
hard.
It is.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is in a scientist's life, like I don't want to give a percentage, but a lot of what we do can feel like failure. And it's like such a slow road forward, right? That it can all just feel like failure because like every day when you're doing something, it probably didn't work. You'll be proven wrong a million times in your own head, but you get away from the personal, effects of it. And then you see it as growth opportunities. Sometimes that's really hard though, right? Because your ego's in it. We're human.
Yeah.
And, people are telling you, oh, you're wrong. And
people
you don't know what you're talking about.
Do people say, no, you're crazy to do that?
All
No,
the time. So think about it. Like we submit, like how do we do work? Well, we submit grants. There's like literally like an 8 to 10% success rate.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that.
So what we're doing as grant reviewers is we're trying to find what's wrong with it. Oh, that's a bad idea. Or that's a stupid idea. Or that's, and scientists, like we just say what we think. We are wonderfully honest, but sometimes it hurts. So if you were to take it personally, right? Well, don't go into science then. But the people who stay in science, like, they're sensitive people. Like we're still humans and stuff. But the reality is we have to see past that and see it as growth potential, growth opportunity. And so it's never a short road. It's always a long road. But if you can see the growth and whatever failure you might perceive to have, if you see the other side of it and just continue to get up, you'll probably get to the other side. And that's just called being, having tenacity, right? And that's probably one of the number one qualities that I think every scientist most likely has to have to do anything.
No, you know what? I thought about what you said in that video and it did make me think about even failure is knowledge. It's knowledge that you didn't have before you failed.
That's right.
I thought about, yeah. So, your words really struck home, so I want to ask you, like, moving forward, what do you think is kind of the next big question that if that's answered in this research area, right, of the microbiome, that's going to open the doors to so many things. Like, what's the next big question, right, that, on the horizon?
I think that if we could understand really what is a healthy microbiome in the context of all different places and people, that would be really helpful. I think one of the things that really bothers me about microbiome research right now is that most of our knowledge actually comes from a North American Caucasian. And I think that's super limiting. And it really bothers me because actually that's probably a minority and we're not also the most healthy population too, right? So we're defining healthy on data that seems really, really skewed and biased. And so it'd be really helpful if we could look in all places of the world and understand. And that was one of my motivations to look in India too, right?
Yeah.
Because when I looked at the Indian population and their microbiome, by my North American Eurocentric brain, I saw data that told me that was unhealthy, but yet they were not. They were very healthy. And so I understood in that moment that everything I understood or had read or had synthesized from evidence was very skewed. And so if we could move forward to really defining what is healthy, I think that would be very helpful when we're trying to solve, well, what is disease? Like, what are we trying to get to here, right?
If there was just one message that you would like to leave people with about the gut microbiome that can help them, in their everyday, like something practical they can take away with, what is important for you to relay to people?
I think practically, you come to food. The less exposure to unnatural chemicals in our food, the better. And that's a very expensive way to eat. I appreciate that. But I think we need to, we do need to think about our gut microbiome, and we need to feed it the appropriate nourishment for it to function perfectly for us.
Wise words to end off with, Deanna. Thank you so much. That was just a really fascinating conversation for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
That's Deanna Gibson. She's a microbiologist and professor in the Department of Biology at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus. For more on Deanna's research and work, you can check out our show notes. That is it for the CRAM podcast today. We hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please consider donating to CRAM so we can keep this podcast going. CRAM is a registered charity, and we rely on you for your support. Just visit cramideas.com. And please follow us on social as well. Our handle is @CRAMideas. Thanks for joining us, and see you back here next time.